This video is part of a series on an idea that I call relevant factor analysis. And as you can probably guess from the name, a relevant factor analysis is just analyzing a problem by identifying the relevant factors and how they affect each other. Now this video is not going to talk about the details of how you would do that analysis, but it's going to talk about why I believe we need to do something like that, why it's important, and why everyone should want to learn something like that. So to start off, in current day research, I would argue that there's not that much thorough investigation. A lot of times we try to find some kind of small effect, but a lot of times we don't really try and figure out why that effect occurs, or why changes happen, or why things happen. And something that we actually do a lot is that we do a study of some kind of small factor and how it affects some big end goal, and we might find that it has a good effect on that end goal or a bad effect on that end goal, but that's what we're looking into. We're doing the study, but we don't actually investigate the why. We just kind of guess. So if we see, okay, it has a good effect, well, let's try and guess why it had that good effect. But we don't put a lot of investigation into the why. We just find the change in the end goal. And as I go over this more, hopefully you'll see why I think this is a problem. So when we do that kind of jump from a very small factor straight to the big end goal, a lot of times we're really oversimplifying the problem as a whole, and there's a lot of details there that never get analyzed. So as you see in the example on the right, there may be a whole bunch of major factors and other sub-factors that come into play that affect that affect the results and the big end goal, but we don't investigate those or how they affect each other. We just go straight from that really small factor to the big end goal. Now let me get into a more tangible example to demonstrate this. Let's say we're investigating health, and more specifically how something like eating chocolate affects our health. So we might do a study and say, well, it seems like eating chocolate seems to have a good effect on cholesterol, and that means it probably has a good effect on our health as well. And it seems like it has a good effect on the blood flow in our brain, so that means maybe it has a good effect on our cognitive functioning as well. And it seems to have a good effect. It seems to reduce heart disease, but it could be bad because it might increase your weight, and that's probably bad. It could be bad because it has a lot of sugar, and that might affect your teeth. So we found some relationships, but we haven't done a lot of investigation into why those relationships happen, so we can't really give very specific answers for an individual. So let's say we actually did it more like a relevant factor analysis, and let me just look at a couple of these factors and say, like, we want to look at nutrition and physique, so things like cholesterol and weight, and how does that affect our health. So if we really looked at all of the relevant factors and analyzed them and how they interact with each other, we could figure out where eating chocolate fits in with the other factors. So we could say, okay, well, we know that nutrition affects your health, and then some of the things that affect your nutrition and physique might be your cholesterol levels and your weight, and your cholesterol might be affected by what you eat, and maybe other things as well. And then what you eat, well, one of the things that you might eat is chocolate. But there's also other cholesterol lowering foods that you might eat, or there's foods that might raise your cholesterol. So you would probably want to know, how do they balance out? Like, how do they affect each other? How do they all add up to affect your cholesterol as a whole? Because eating chocolate is only one small part of the things you eat, probably. you probably don't only eat chocolate. So, how do they add up? Because for you as an individual, you might eat certain things that make it so that it doesn't matter that much if you eat chocolate or not to reduce your cholesterol, or it might not have much beneficial effect for you because of the other things you eat, or maybe it has even more of a beneficial effect for you specifically because of the things you eat. And on the other side, the same things might be true. Like you might be looking at weight and then seeing the factors that go in there. Maybe some of the factors are your body type, maybe you're just born naturally on the heavy side or on the more underweight side, or and then also how much you exercise is going to impact your weight, and also what you eat. And then eating chocolate is just a small portion of what you eat, probably again. And then you also probably eat other things, and all of those things add together, and they all might have a different effect based on you as an individual. So if you just took the average result for everyone that says, okay, well, it's good for this, that might not apply to you as an individual because your own factors might be different from the average. So maybe you do more or less of something. Maybe you have a higher weight or a lower weight than the average person, and as a result, the effect that this small factor has on you is different than the effect it has on the average person. So you don't even know if the result is going to apply to you as an individual. So unless you know what the factors are and how they affect each other, you aren't going to know how the thing you're looking at is going to affect you as an individual. So that's why you need this kind of thorough investigation and consideration of all the factors out there. Now, to look at another point, I would argue that in a lot of the research we do, there aren't very many guarantees or very many absolutes. So a lot of times we're only looking at like a large scale effect. We're only looking at the average over a population or something like that. And there really are a lot of problems with that. So not everyone is like the average person. So an average result is not going to hold for everyone. And maybe your own individual characteristics will make it so that you actually, like, it has the opposite effect for you than it does for the average person. But you're not going to know that, again, unless you investigate the relevant factors. And there's even ways that it could play out where, maybe a small number of people really skew the average, and you aren't able to identify that in your research. So you just take the average, but the average doesn't even hold for the majority of people because it's skewed by a small number of people. So then you may have something that's actually just not correct for the majority of the people, even though it is what the average comes out to be. So it's not like you're not finding something that you can say, yes, chocolate is absolutely good for everyone, or it's absolutely bad for everyone. You're finding something that's kind of like, well, it seems like it's more likely good for you than not, but it's like a random chance. It's kind of like gambling. It's like you're kind of betting on the odds, so we're trying to tell you what we think the odds are, and we're like, okay, you have a 70% chance to be healthy, but if you eat chocolate, it goes up to 71%, and you're like, well, I guess my odds go up, so I guess I should probably do it. But you don't know if it's going to be good for you or not. You don't know if it's going to make a difference. Like, you don't know if that 1% is going to matter or not. So it's really kind of just like gambling. You're just kind of betting, and you have no idea what the end result will be. And again, you don't even know if those are the correct odds for you as an individual, because, again, maybe you're not like the average person. You have your own individual characteristics that make you different. So maybe those odds don't apply to you, and the odds are actually worse for you. But the point is that it's not something that you know for sure. You're just kind of like gambling and hoping that it works out for you. And then, so it's clear that in a lot of these cases, there are big missing factors that aren't being investigated. And in another video, I'll talk about how you identify missing factors, but you can see that there's other things that come into play that aren't being investigated, and we don't even know how those affect the end result. So we just look at some really small factor and jump straight to the big end goal, but then we ignore all these other potential important factors and don't investigate them, and that will lead to some big potential problems, as I'm going to show in this next example. So for another more tangible example, let's say we're investigating the death rate from a specific cancer, and more specifically, we're investigating the effect that some chemical, say chemical A, has on the death rate from this specific cancer. And we see that people who have chemical A in their body have a 1.1x increase in the death rate from this specific cancer at the population level. And it's like, well, I guess that's useful to know, kind of, but it's not that useful because, again, it's just like a random odd and it doesn't account for like individual factors. So I don't know if this applies to me. Am I, as an individual, going to have a 1.1x higher chance? Or because of other factors just related to me, is my risk going to be different? Well, no one knows. We only did a population study. We didn't test, individual groups of people. So if we actually tried and figured out what the factors were, let's say we have this hypothetical example where we find out that some genetic factor A, is also a major factor, and that really contributes to determining whether or not we die from this specific cancer. And then we find out the way it works is that if you don't have genetic factor A, you're not at any risk at all. Like, even if you come into contact with chemical A, if you don't have genetic factor A, you're not going to die from this specific cancer. So you have no risk. But if you do have genetic factor A, maybe you're at really high risk, and if you come into contact with this chemical, then you have a really high chance of dying from this specific cancer. That would be really nice to know, because then we could improve our estimation of the odds. It wouldn't just be like pure gambling without that much information. We would have more information. So in this hypothetical scenario, we could say, okay, if you don't have genetic factor A, we have a guarantee you're not going to die from this specific cancer, because we were able to show that no one dies from it if they don't have this genetic factor A. But if you do have genetic factor A, you have a really high risk. And then something you should notice is, in this hypothetical example, it's not 100%, so there's still other factors out there that we would want to investigate. So we could figure out, okay, why is it that some people who have genetic factor A don't die even though most people do? So we would have another thing to investigate, but at the very least, we've been able to identify some kind of major factor that helps us calculate the odds more accurately for an individual person, and it doesn't just have to be, a population level estimate. Now, to carry on with a similar example, but with a different relevant factor, let's say instead we find that chemical B is also a major relevant factor. So it's not a genetic factor this time. This time chemical B is a different major factor that we didn't know about, but it's also contributing to the death rate from a specific cancer. And the way that it works is that if you only have chemical A in your body, you're probably going to be fine. And if you only have chemical B in your body, you're probably going to be fine. But if you have both of them, then you're at high risk. So this would be really important to know, because then we would know, okay, if something changes with, for example, the rate at which chemical B is used, then chemical A becomes a much higher risk. So let's say during the initial study period, chemical B was something that wasn't widely used. So, like, maybe it existed in a few people, but it wasn't common. And as a result, the study was accurate for the situation at the time, which is not many people had chemical B in their bodies, so there was only a very small increase in the rate of death from this specific cancer. But, so this is the original study situation. But let's say, people found that chemical B actually had some kind of, like, it was really effective at something. So they started to use it for some reason. Maybe it was a good pesticide or something like that. It was really good at something, so it started to become widely used. And then all of a sudden, now it's a completely different scenario because now chemical B is being widely used and a lot of people have it in their bodies. So now chemical A is actually leading to a really big increase in the death rate from some specific cancer because chemical B was a major factor that we didn't identify. And so if we don't identify the major factors, then we won't know when they change. And if we don't do another study when the factors change, then our study might be obsolete. It may no longer apply. So, like in this example, the study we did originally could have been perfect. It could have found the exact truth at that point in time. But if something changed, then the results might not hold anymore. So that's why this type of study, the result that you get, isn't going to be good enough. It's not something you want to rely on. It's not an absolute or a guarantee that things will always be that way. Because if there are any other factors out there affecting the problem, and those factors change, the results are going to change too. And if you don't know what the other factors are, you don't know when the results change. So you don't know if the results are still currently true for the present time or not. So I hope you can agree that that's probably a problem, because if you don't actually identify what the other factors are and how they affect the end result, then you just don't know if you can trust the results still at the current point in time. Now, another thing I want to talk about is that I feel like you're just never taught how to do good analysis and critical thinking. It's not something that you're taught at any level, like elementary, middle school, high school, or even college. I would say you're not really taught how to do it. It's not something anyone explains to you. There's no class on it. And a lot of times I would argue that people just kind of assume that it's easy or that it's obvious. So, you'll have people who don't have experience with any of this just going into some random problem and assuming that I'm probably doing a good analysis on it because, I'm a smart person. It can't be that hard. I'm smart, or something like that. There's kind of this feeling that it's not like a difficult thing to do, but I'd argue that it really is difficult, and it's something that you really need to practice and make sure you're doing a good job at it, because otherwise you might not be doing a good job at it. And then, not only that, I would say a lot of times it's kind of just left to an individual's intuition or talent. So, kind of like people see your results in school and say, okay, well, you must be smart, so that must mean you're good at analyzing, you're good at doing this kind of research stuff. And so you're probably doing it well because you're smart. But sometimes it's more like you have good results because you're successful, and successful might be like playing the system. It might be, being good at writing research papers or something like that, being good at being persuasive or finding interesting results that people want to see. And if you look it up, you can find a lot of people who say that there's a good amount of fraud in the research system. So, and then a lot of those people who are committing fraud tend to be really successful until they're caught. But, for all we know, there might be a lot of people out there who just haven't been caught yet. So, these people who are really successful might not really be finding meaningful or useful or even honest results. Maybe they're just good at playing the system. And as a result, we don't know, no one teaches you how to analyze it. No one teaches you, how can I figure out, is this a meaningful result for me? Is this something useful for me? Or is it not? Is it questionable? Should I doubt it? Is it fraud? I don't know. It's no one teaches you this. So I hope that with this series of videos, I can kind of help with that problem and give people a method for analyzing things that they don't know, or trying to learn about something, or kind of do research on something, or develop an idea. And finally, I think we really need something like this if we want to make progress and if we want to have long-term meaningful results. So if we don't just want to have interesting studies where you get some kind of result on the average, but it's missing so many things, again, if someone says, well, on the average, chocolate was good at reducing heart disease, well, that doesn't tell you as an individual if it's good for you. That doesn't tell you if it's going to be good in the future, because things might change in the future. So the study's results might become irrelevant or obsolete in the future, but we don't know when that might be or why that might be. And so in a lot of ways, I would argue that those kinds of results just aren't that useful. It's not that they're necessarily wrong, and it's not that they have no meaning at all, but their usefulness is really limited, and they tend to kind of be taken out of context or misused a lot. And then if we do more of this actual analysis, we learn how to do it and we use it to try and solve problems, then we would have an approach that's more resistant to fraud and random chance. So like I was saying, some people say that there might be a lot of fraud in the academic system, in the research system. And even if it's not fraud, if you rely on random studies, you're still vulnerable to random chance. So you might have something that actually works, but because you randomly rolled an unlucky roll, you happen to pick people for what your conclusion didn't hold, and you got unlucky, so you don't get to publish your study or whatever. So no one knows that the thing you found was actually good or correct, but you got unlucky, so no one's going to find it. Or on the flip side, maybe you got a really lucky roll and you happen to only find people who fit an interesting conclusion, and whether it's by fraud or data manipulation, or it's by random chance, you're being honest and you just happen to get really lucky and pull all the people who fit the conclusion you wanted to see, well, now you're going to have something that isn't actually true being promoted as, truth because of random chance or fraud. So if you actually did, analysis instead and tried to use better logic and better reasoning, it would be harder to fake that. You would have to actually guarantee it, show why you believe it, and not just rely on random results, from random testing. Then if you do more of this relevant factor analysis, the results you get would actually be useful to individuals. So I talk about this in a different video, but like if you do a study, for example, that finds an average result, as I keep saying, that's not something that you can just assume automatically applies to any single individual. It might not, and it might not even apply to the majority of individuals. So at an individual level, you can't take that result and determine anything from it for you. So if you find a result that says, on the average, chocolate is associated with a reduced risk in heart disease, well, that doesn't say anything about whether or not it will reduce your risk as an individual, because of your individual characteristics might cause it to have a different result for you, but you don't know. So you can't use that result in any way as an individual to prove something for yourself or at an individual level. All it can tell you is about the population as a whole. But again, I talk about that a lot more in a different video, so that's all I'll say on that for now. And finally, if you do more relevant factor analysis, you're actually building up a foundation that you can use in the future and that other people can build off of more reliably. So it will allow you to make a lot more predictions about similar things. So if I only have a study on, say, does chocolate, reduce heart disease, and then the result is yes, well, if I don't have any more information than that, then I can't really make any conclusions on whether or not cake reduces heart disease. Does cake reduce heart disease or not? Well, I don't know. I didn't investigate cake. Or what does it have to be chocolate cake? Does that work? What about ice cream? Does ice cream reduce heart disease or not? What if it's chocolate ice cream? Does that reduce heart disease? What about cookies? What about, brownies? I don't know. Well, we didn't investigate those things, so we can't really even make a prediction as to whether or not it does or not. But if we actually did a relevant factor analysis and we identified the factors that mattered, we could say, okay, this is the reason why. These are the factors that come into play. This is how these factors affect someone's risk of having heart disease, and this is where chocolate fits in that. Then we can say, okay, well, now that we know all of these factors, we can say, okay, probably cake does or doesn't affect it in that way because it affects those specific factors in this way, or it behaves in this specific way. Or if it's like with the chemicals examples, well, maybe so we found a result for chemical A, but if we don't know why, we would have to do the exact same process with chemical B and say, oh, well, does chemical B cause cancer? Does chemical C cause cancer? Because we don't know why it does. We don't know what the factors are that affect whether or not it increases the odds. We just have to manually investigate every single possibility, every single chemical, and we can't make any predictions. So if we knew the factors, then we could say, okay, well, chemical B also shares the factor that chemical A has, so we believe that the effect will be similar to the effect that chemical A has, or something like that. Chemical B doesn't have that, so we think it'll be different. And of course, we won't be able to find everything, but we will have that foundation to build off of, and then as we do more research, we can get into more of the details and, build it out more and develop more of the foundation until we have a better understanding of the entire picture. So instead of just having some small piece of information that doesn't really fit in anywhere and can't make any predictions about anything else, we can develop something that actually does make predictions about similar things and can have long-term use. So another one is that like you wouldn't know if like the results are going to be the same for a long time or if they might change really quickly in the real world, because if you don't identify the relevant factors, then you don't know what else might change over time and cause our results to be irrelevant or to be incorrect or misleading in the future. So these are the reasons why I think it's really important we do more analysis and stuff like that. And I hope that through this video series, I can actually help people understand like a way that you might do this kind of analysis or do stronger research that builds a better foundation and leads to more progress in the future.